Hi, plant propagators. In an earlier unit, you learned that there are many methods of asexual or vegetative propagation. Unlike sexual propagation, which involves seed or spores, asexual techniques involve no exchange of genetic material between male and female cells, and the plants resulting from asexual propagation are genetically identical to the parent plant. They're clones. In this unit, we're going to focus on stem cuttings. By the end of this unit, you'll be able to describe which parts of the stem that softwood, semi-hardwood, and hardwood cuttings are taken from, and outline how to prepare softwood, semi-hardwood, and hardwood cuttings. You may remember from an earlier unit that a cutting is any part of a plant that's removed from the mother plant, then treated in ways that stimulate regeneration of the missing organs. In the case of stem cuttings, those missing organs are the roots. We're taking advantage of plant cells' totipotency, which refers to the ability of cells to de-differentiate, form new areas of meristematic growth, and then re-differentiate as cells of the missing organs. We can promote this activity by the wounding process involved in taking the cutting and by applying exogenous auxins. Let's review the applications of asexual propagation techniques, which includes stem cuttings. Asexual propagation techniques are essential when we want to reproduce desirable characteristics of the parent plant. For example, variegated foliage, a specific growth habit, specific biochemical properties of the parent plant, or a plant of a specific sex. Stem cuttings are also used for propagating hybrid plants which don't come true when grown from seed. We can also use stem cuttings for some plants that are sterile and don't produce any seeds, and for plants that rarely produce viable seed. Although there's been rapid growth in the use of propagation by tissue culture over the last 20 years, stem cuttings are still one of the most widely used propagation techniques. In addition to the applications mentioned in the previous slide, there can be some advantages to propagating plants from stem cuttings, even when they can be grown successfully from seed. For example, we can often obtain a marketable plant faster from stem cuttings than we can from seed. This is particularly true if the seed needs a period of cold stratification prior to sowing in order to break dormancy. Examples of this would be our native shrubs, snowberry, manzanita, and some of the ceanothus species. Propagating plants from cuttings can also shorten or avoid the juvenile stage of a plant's growth, which is useful if flowers and/or edible fruit are the desirable characteristics of the plant. During its juvenile period, a plant is physiologically incapable of flowering, and therefore also incapable of producing fruit. For some plants, the juvenile period can last as long as 16 years, sometimes more. And if you're a commercial fruit grower, it's not economically viable to wait this long for your plants to produce fruit. If we take stem cuttings from plants that are not juvenile, we can bypass the period of juvenility because the cuttings inherit the mature characteristics of the wood they're taken from. We'll come back to the concept of juvenility in a separate unit. Despite having several advantages, stem cuttings also, of course, have some drawbacks. They're typically more labor-intensive than growing from seed, so plants grown from cuttings are more expensive to produce. Successful propagation from cuttings can require having more specialized facilities than growing from seed, although there are many growers who still produce high-quality rooted cuttings in very simple structures that have very little in the way of humidity and temperature control. In spite of our advances in our knowledge of plant biochemistry and of technological advances in greenhouse design and environmental control, there's still much we have to learn about the production of adventitious roots in plants, and many plants still remain impossible or hard to root from cuttings, like our native coast live oak, Quercus agrifolia, pictured on the right here. Finally, there's no single rooting protocol for all species. Although this can be frustrating, it's also one of the challenges that makes plant propagation so exciting and so interesting and so fascinating. Stem cuttings are probably the type of cutting that people are most familiar with. They're taken from a section of stem tissue that consists of lateral and sometimes terminal buds. They might be up to 2 feet long, or in micropropagation, barely 2 millimeters long. And there are several different types of stem cutting. Part of the art and skill of the propagator is selecting the most appropriate method, depending on the structures and the equipment we have to manage the propagation environment, and the type of plant and species being propagated. Let's take a look at the different types of stem cutting and some of the plants they're used for. We can classify stem cuttings based on the maturity of the stem tissue we use for propagation. Cuttings from woody plants, which are trees, shrubs, and subshrubs, are classified as hardwood, semi-ripe or semi-hardwood, and softwood cuttings. From herbaceous perennials and annuals, we can take herbaceous cuttings, which are similar to softwood cuttings taken from woody plants. Stem cuttings can also be classified as tip or terminal cuttings, or nodal cuttings. Tip or terminal cuttings include the terminal bud, as shown in the photo. Softwood cuttings are often tip cuttings because it's the region of youngest growth on the stem. Nodal cuttings are any stem cuttings that don't include the terminal bud, and are sometimes also referred to as basal or subterminal cuttings. Cuttings exhibit polarity. Polarity refers to the characteristic of shoots arising at one end of a cutting and roots growing at the other end. In stem cuttings, shoots arise at the distal end and roots arise at the proximal end. The distal end is the end furthest away from the crown of the plant, and the proximal end is the one closest to the crown. Root cuttings also exhibit polarity, but shoots arise at the proximal end and roots at the distal end with root cuttings. The take-home message from the concept of polarity is always stick cuttings the right way up. It's also good practice to keep all your cuttings the right way up when they're being prepared. This helps to make sure they're stuck the right way up, and it usually saves some time if they are placed neatly in a pile, all facing the same direction during preparation. Sometimes it can be difficult to tell which way is up when cuttings are being prepared, so it's good practice to make different cuts at the distal and proximal ends to distinguish between the two. For example, make a slanted cut at the proximal, the bottom end, and a straight cut at the distal end. The characteristic of polarity can be so strong that stem cuttings may still root at the proximal end even when they're stuck the wrong way up, as in the photo here, where you can see cuttings of grapevine that produced roots at the proximal end after the cutting was stuck upside down. Let's take a closer look now at the different types of cutting. In the photo here, you can see a section of stem that's about 2 feet long from black stem Pittosporum, which is an evergreen shrub native to New Zealand. And you see it used a lot around Santa Cruz and Monterey counties, particularly as a hedge. The stem here has been turned on its side in order to show more of it in greater detail. The softwood is the current season's newest growth, and it's found at the ends of the stems. It's soft and sappy and usually very pliable because no bark or lignin has developed yet. Semi-hardwood cuttings, or stems rather, are also from the current season's growth, but have started to develop some bark. Semi-hardwood stems are still fairly pliable, but not as pliable as softwood growth. Hardwood growth is also from the current season's growth, but the stem has bark and is much less pliable than semi-hardwood growth. Note that hardwood, when it refers to a type of cutting, doesn't refer to the much older, very woody growth that's 2 years old or more. On many shrubs and trees, including this Pittosporum here, there's a change in color along the stem as the tissue ages, which makes it quite easy to distinguish between the different types of wood used for cuttings. In the Pittosporum in the photo, you may be able to see that the softwood and semi-hardwood stems are very dark, almost black, whereas the hardwood growth is paler, and growth from 2 years ago, over here on the left, is almost grayish brown. Hardwood cuttings can be taken from both winter deciduous species and from narrow-leaved evergreen shrubs and trees. Let's look at the winter deciduous species first. Hardwood cuttings here are taken from the past season's growth, usually from late fall through early spring during the plant's dormant season, when winter deciduous species have dropped their leaves. Hardwood cuttings usually have a stem diameter that's at least the thickness of a pencil or more, depending on the species, and they vary in length from around 4 inches to 2.5 feet. They have a minimum of 2 nodes, but usually more, and the basal cut is usually made about a 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch below a node. Hardwood cuttings of winter deciduous species are quicker and easier to prepare than semi-hardwood cuttings because there are no leaves to remove. Even though hardwood cuttings of deciduous species have no leaves, they can still dry out, so treat them in much the same way as you would semi-hardwood material. Don't leave them in the sun and plant them promptly. They can be wrapped in moist burlap and stored in the fridge or cooler if they're not going to be planted straight away. Hardwood cuttings are usually treated with a rooting compound before sticking. Examples of winter deciduous woody plants that can be propagated from hardwood cuttings include edible figs, roses, pomegranate, grapevine, wisteria, dogwood, elderberry, and mulberry. Many narrow-leafed evergreens can also be propagated from hardwood cuttings. Narrow-leaf evergreens is a generic term for evergreen conifers such as juniper, thuya, chemicepris, spruce, hemlock, pine, fir, redwoods, and cypress. Hardwood cuttings of narrow-leaved evergreens are usually taken from late fall through late winter during the dormant season. They usually root best in a greenhouse with bottom heat of between 75 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit, plus mist. Mature terminal shoots of the previous season's growth are usually used, and the foliage is removed from the bottom half to 1/3 of the cutting, as you can see in the photo. Cuttings are usually 4 to 8 inches long and less than the thickness of a pencil. Narrow-leaved evergreens can be slow to root, but relatively easy to root species include chemicepris, platycladus, afrocarpus, thuya, and some of the low-growing junipers. A rooting compound is applied to the base of the cuttings, with the strength of the rooting compound depending on the ease of rooting of the species that you're working with. Semi-hardwood cuttings are usually taken in late spring through midsummer, when the current season's growth has started to mature but hasn't yet become woody. In California, where we have a year-round growing season in some parts of the state, it's possible to take semi-hardwood cuttings from some plants at almost any time of the year. The length and thickness of semi-hardwood cuttings depends on the species and cultivar and the amount of material available. Semi-hardwood cuttings usually have at least 2 nodes. Personally, I prefer to have 3, just in case one or more of the axillary buds dies. The basal cut is made about a 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch below a node. Some propagators like to make a basal cut that's angled at about 45 degrees, as it provides a larger surface area than a straight cut that's exposed to the rooting compound. The leaves and any petioles are removed from the bottom third of the cutting as close as possible to the stem, but leave the axillary buds intact though. Don't cut them off, as this is where new shoots are going to be produced. If you cut the axillary buds off, your cutting may still root, but it'll never be able to produce any shoots. If the cutting has large leaves, these can be reduced in size by about 1/3 to 1/2 to reduce water loss, as you can see on the leaves of these pomegranate cuttings in the photo on the right. At the bottom nodes, some propagators do like to cut off the axillary buds, as well as the leaves. But it leaves a larger cut that pathogens can enter through, so personally I prefer to leave the bottom axillary buds intact. Also, endogenous auxins, which are the auxins produced naturally by the plant and which promote adventitious root development, are produced by the plant in young leaf tissue, which is found in the axillary buds. So it also makes sense to leave the axillary buds intact from a physiological point of view. The top cut is made just above a node. Make the cut about 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch above the node, and don't leave a long section of internode, as it's just going to die and will be an ideal source of infection by secondary pathogens. Before sticking, the cutting is dipped in an appropriate strength rooting compound. The length of time that semi-hardwood cuttings take to root depends on the species. Adventitious roots may appear within as little as 7 days in some species, and cuttings may be ready to transplant in about 4 to 6 weeks, while others may take as long as 4 months and not be ready to transplant until they're about 6 months old. Semi-hardwood cuttings are usually rooted under fog or mist, sometimes a combination of the two. Bottom heat between 70 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit can speed up the rooting process, but isn't always essential, especially during the warm summer months in California for many of the easier to root species. Shading of at least 50% is recommended in order to keep the aerial parts of the cuttings cooler and reduce water loss from evapotranspiration. Examples of plants that can be propagated relatively easily from semi-hardwood cuttings include most of the shrubby salvias, rosemary, lavender, camellia, ceanothus, and manzanita. Softwood cuttings are often, but not always, tip cuttings, taken from the current season's growth. Softwood cuttings often root very quickly and can sometimes be ready to transplant in less than 8 weeks. But they're really vulnerable to wilting and much more susceptible to pathogens because of the soft leaf and stem tissue. So you have to pay greater attention to maintaining a high level of relative humidity to reduce water loss from evapotranspiration, and you have to pay close attention to nursery hygiene practices. Preparing softwood cuttings is the same as semi-hardwood cuttings, but the terminal bud is left intact. Applying a rooting compound isn't always necessary, but it can help speed up the rooting process, which is important when you're in a race against the pathogens. Using a rooting compound also promotes more uniform rooting. The strength of the rooting compound used is usually less than for semi-hardwood cuttings. Ideally, softwood cuttings are rooted under high relative humidity created with a high-pressure fog system. The larger amount of water applied in a mist system can result in the medium being too wet and the base of the cuttings rotting. Shading of between 50 and 70% in summer is usually essential. Herbaceous cuttings are similar to softwood cuttings, but are taken from herbaceous annuals and perennials. Like softwood cuttings, they wilt quickly, so need to be rooted under high humidity, and again are susceptible to pathogens because the stem tissue is so soft. Again, like softwood cuttings, a rooting compound may not be necessary, but it can help speed up the rooting process and promote rooting uniformity. Many of the large multinational plant breeders of herbaceous annuals and perennials are Dutch, German, or North American. While much of their research and development may be done in their home countries, most of them also have production nurseries in countries such as Costa Rica, El Salvador, Ecuador, Guatemala, Ethiopia, and Kenya, where stock plants of plants they have introduced to the nursery trade are grown. These countries are close to the equator, so light quality is consistent year-round, and stock plants can be grown year-round. Also, both labor and land are much cheaper. Herbaceous cutting material is harvested from the stock plants throughout much of the year, packaged immediately and shipped overnight across the world to wholesale nurseries as unrooted cuttings, or URCs. At their destination, these cuttings are received and stuck immediately. If they can't be stuck immediately, they're stored overnight in coolers and stuck as soon as possible. Many of the URCs are still being stuck by hand, but an increasing number of larger nurseries is investing in robotic cutting stickers. These machines are expensive, but enable nurseries to cut their labor costs and vastly increase efficiency because the machines are so much faster than humans. Pacific Plug and Liner, which is on Casserly Road in Watsonville, is a subsidiary of the Pacific Northwest nursery Smith Gardens. It's been investing heavily in automation over the last 3 years and is using robotic cutting stickers for most of its cuttings. We sometimes go to Pacific Plug and Liner, or PP&L as it's usually known, on a field trip, which unfortunately we obviously can't do this year. But there's a link to a video of Pacific Plug and Liner's operations in Canvas for you to watch after this lecture as a virtual field trip. It gives you a good overview of how URCs and automation fit into modern horticulture. Our goal with stem cuttings is to produce a healthy young plant that has a well-formed root system and can successfully be transplanted to a larger container in as short a time as possible. But let's take a quick look at what happens before that. Let's look at what happens after we've prepared a cutting, applied the appropriate strength rooting compound, and stuck the cutting. First of all, the outer injured cells next to the cut surface at the base of the cutting die. A necrotic plate forms, which is basically a layer of dead cells, and the wound is sealed with suberin, which is a waxy substance produced by the plant. The xylem may also plug with gum. This means that the cutting can no longer take up water through the xylem. The cutting is still losing water through respiration, though, and will also continue to lose water through evapotranspiration. Living cells behind that necrotic plate then begin to divide after a few days, and a layer of parenchyma cells form callus. Callus may be visible on the outside of the cuttings as small, irregularly shaped, creamy white growths that look a little bit like bits of perlite are stuck to the cutting. You can see a small amount of callus at the base of the cutting on the far left here. Some cells in the region of the vascular cambium and phloem then begin to divide and initiate de novo adventitious roots. Then the root initials develop into organized root primordia. Lastly, there's growth and emergence of the root primordia through the stem tissue. And you can see those root primordia in this cutting on the left here. There's these little white bumps just underneath the epidermis that are about to break their way through. And after that, there's the formation of new vascular tissue between the root primordia and the existing vascular tissue of the cutting. Once that's happened, the cutting is able to start taking up water and any nutrients that may be in the substrate. How quickly all of this happens depends on the species and cultivar and the environmental conditions in the propagation environment. While cuttings are rooting, it's always tempting to pull them out of the plug tray or flat to see if they've rooted. Try to avoid doing this frequently though, as it can easily tear the fragile new roots. A gentle tug on a cutting is usually enough to see if rooting has started. If you feel some resistance, then roots have probably started. If the cutting starts to move quite easily, then roots probably haven't started to grow. Rooted cuttings are ready to transplant when they've got a well-developed root system. Loose fill media in plug trays should stay with the cutting, as shown in the photo here. If the medium falls away from the roots, it's because the root system isn't developed enough to hold all of the medium together, or it can also be because the medium is very, very porous and contains a high percentage of relatively large components such as perlite. If this continues to happen, you may consider backing off on the perlite in your propagation medium and using more coconut fiber or maybe peat. Cuttings may require hardening off before or immediately after transplanting. Once the roots have emerged through the epidermis, humidity levels can be reduced and misting frequencies can also be reduced and light levels can be increased. This may all entail moving the cuttings to another greenhouse or hoop house. If the cuttings have been slow to root, a foliar feed may be necessary. When you're transplanting cuttings, be gentle with the roots. New roots are fragile. You may want to avoid pulling the cutting out of a flat so that you don't tear the young roots. Instead, scoop it out from the bottom if the roots are fragile. When you're transplanting the cutting and are backfilling the planting hole with the appropriate medium, don't press down too hard on the potting mix, as this can tear the roots. It can also reduce the porosity of the medium, which will limit the amount of oxygen available in the substrate. As always, let's finish by summarizing the material covered in this unit. A cutting is any part of a plant that's removed from the mother plant, then treated in ways that stimulate regeneration of the missing organs. Techniques of propagating plants from stem cuttings are asexual or vegetative methods, and the resulting plants are clones of their parent. Propagation techniques using stem cuttings are useful for reproducing desirable characteristics of the parent plant, for propagating hybrids, sterile plants, and plants which don't flower and produce seed reliably. They're also useful for reproducing a plant of a specific sex. Stem cuttings can be categorized according to the age of the stem as hardwood, semi-hardwood, or softwood cuttings. Herbaceous cuttings are taken from herbaceous perennials and annuals. Stem cuttings can also be classified as tip or terminal cuttings when they retain the terminal bud, or as nodal or basal cuttings when they don't include the terminal bud. Some cuttings don't need a rooting compound to be applied to the base, but using exogenous auxins can speed up the production of adventitious roots and promote rooting uniformity. The strength of the rooting compound used depends on the type of wood and the species. In general, herbaceous and softwood cuttings need less auxin than semi-hardwood, and semi-hardwood cuttings need less than hardwood, but there's a lot of variation between species. Now that we've finished this unit, next, go on a virtual field trip to Pacific Plug and Liner in Watsonville to see how they're automating their propagation of URCs, unrooted cuttings, and other processes at their nursery. There's also a virtual field trip to Burncoose nurseries in the southwest of England, where you'll see semi-hardwood cuttings being prepared. Burncoose is small, but it's one of the most renowned nurseries in the UK, producing high-quality plants that are more unusual and aren't typically available in retail nurseries. I hope you enjoy the virtual field trips.